Conflicts between objectives. The main government objectives are low unemployment, stable prices, economic growth, and balance of the balance of payments. Achieving any one of these objectives can result in conflict with other objectives. These conflicts are also known as trade-offs. So the first conflict we'll look at is between inflation and unemployment. We know that the government has given the Bank of England a target of 2% inflation, and the government also has a target of low unemployment. So the first thing the government might think with these two objectives is, which one do we give most priority to? And usually it's inflation. The government would put most priority in tackling inflation. And so to tackle inflation, it's likely that the government would start to try to dampen aggregate demand, to slow down our spending. If we slow down our spending, there's less pressure on prices going up, less pressure on inflation. The first thought when controlling inflation is to dampen aggregate demand. Draw this diagram to show how, when aggregate demand is reduced, it moves to the left and the price level falls, which means inflation is coming under control. This is due to less spending, which means less upward pressure on prices. To achieve this, the government might increase taxes, or the Monetary Policy Committee might increase interest rates. The overall impact of these moves may prevent inflation, but they may also mean less spending in the economy. Now we start to see the conflict with unemployment, because as we start to reduce our consumption, reduce our spending, then firms find that their demand has diminished and they might start laying off workers because they are unable to sell their goods and services. This does help inflation. As workers are laid off, their consumption falls. But also, the threat of unemployment reduces spending of those still in jobs. This puts downward pressure on prices and upward pressure on unemployment. The best diagram to draw to show this trade-off between inflation and unemployment is the Phillips curve. And here we can see in this diagram that at point A there is high inflation and low unemployment. But if the government tries to move to point B through its fiscal or monetary policies, it only gets rid of inflation at the expense of unemployment. The next conflict of objectives is economic growth and sustainability. We can measure economic growth by measuring GDP. However, economic growth can be unsustainable in that it causes inflation or is detrimental to the environment. This diagram shows short-run economic growth as aggregate demand moves out to the right and closer to the long-run aggregate supply 1. By doing this, it is closing the negative output gap and increasing the price level and inflation. It also shows a movement to the right of LRAS1 to LRAS2. This is long-run economic growth. This is an increase in the economy's economic potential and shows how increased supply can cope with the increased aggregate demand at Y3, resulting in a fall in the price level. Increasing short-run and long-run economic growth will be improving the nation's standard of living. For standards of living to be sustainable, growth must not occur at the expense of future generations. The conflict is between enjoying a resource today and someone else enjoying it in the future. This is most important when considering those affected by damage to the environment when we consume resources today. So if our increased use of fuel, such as oil, means that there is more global warming, growth may not be as desirable as it first appears. Governments must make a choice weighing up the welfare of today's generation with that of tomorrow to achieve sustainable growth. Inflation and the equilibrium on the current account of the balance of payments. Controlling inflation should make a country more competitive internationally and therefore lead to an improvement in the balance of payments. Exports become relatively cheap and imports relatively expensive. Therefore, controlling inflation should not conflict with dealing with a balance of payments deficit. However, the actions required to control inflation can damage the balance of payments. For example, increasing interest rates to control inflation might have the effect of increasing the exchange rate, strengthening the pound, which in turn makes exports more expensive, so we're likely to sell less, and makes imports cheaper, and we're likely to buy more, making the balance of payments deficit worse. By contrast, a contractionary fiscal policy, which might alternatively be used to control inflation, tends to improve the balance of payments because people have less money to purchase foreign goods.